And welcome to the last video in Tricky Parts section. In this video, we are going to cover closures. Before I start explaining closures, let's first write an example and then we'll go through it to actually see what closures are. Okay, so let's say that we have a function. Const outer is equal to an arrow function. I'm going to let you know why outer in just a second. And then inside of here, we're going to have a variable called outer var, which is going to be equal to just a string of hello. Now inside of here, let's try console.logging the outer variable. And let's also call the function. So we're going to call the function outer. But just before that, let's also try to console log the outer variable from here. So outer var. If you learn the scope well, you should already know that we shouldn't get anything in here. The outer variable is declared only in this scope right here, so this should give us an error. If we try running it, you can see that we get outer var is not defined. That's fine. So now let's remove that error and let's just do it like this. So we have a function, we have a variable, and then we're console logging that variable. If we do that, we of course get hello. So what is the point of this? I just wanted to let you know that as soon as the function executes, all of its contents are gone. They're dead. They don't exist anymore. So if we call this function and then it runs, it goes from line 3, line 4, 5, 6. As soon as it's done with the execution, everything that's inside is dead. It's gone. And this is where the concept of closures comes in. That's exactly why we call this function outer, because now we're going to have a function inside of a function. We are going to call this function inner, so inner function. And then inside of there, we are, if you can guess it, going to create a variable called inner var, which is going to be equal to, let's just do hi instead of hello. And then now, instead of console logging just the outer var, inside of here, we are going to console log both the outer var and also the inner var. So now if you remove this console log, what do you think is going to happen if we try calling the inner function just like this? Do we even have access to it? As you can see, since the inner function is inside of this scope, we cannot call it like this because it belongs to the scope of the outer function. I know this might be confusing, but we can also return the inner function from the outer function. We can do that. And that's the concept of closures. So what can we do now since we are returning the inner function? Well, we can put it in a new variable. So const inner function, and then we can call the outer function. If you remember correctly, if we call the function, that gives us what the function is returning. In this case, the function is returning yet another function. So now we can finally call this inner function just like that. Okay, so why is this a closure? Well, if we save it, you can see we do get both hello and hi. And that's kind of crazy. Why? Well, of course, if we call the inner function just right here, so if we call it right here, you can see it has the access to the variable from the outer scope. As you can see, we have the inner variable, but it has also the outer variable. That's nothing special because we can access in the inner scope, we can access variables from the outer scope right here. But if you look at this case where we create a function outside of a return, in here, we just have the inner function. And this whole thing, this outer function gets kind of deleted. We don't have access to the outer variable, which the inner function is referencing to. But because of the closures, we have access to the variables of the parent scope. So as soon as you call it like this, return the function, closures come in, and they give you access to the variables from the parent scope. That's called closures, and that's the reason why, even when calling the variable like this, we get both hi and hello. Let's go through this one more time just to make sure you understand it. Normally, when you exit a function, all of its variables, quote unquote, disappear. This is because nothing needs them anymore. But what if you declare a function inside a function? Then the inner function could still be called later and read the variables from the outer scope. In practice, this is very useful, but for this to work, the outer functions variable need to quote-unquote stick around somewhere. So in this case, JavaScript takes care of keeping the variables alive instead of forgetting them as it would usually do, and that is called a closure. In other words, a closure gives you access to the outer function scope in here from an inner function just like this one. In JavaScript, closures are created every time a function is created at function creation time. I'm sure you still have some questions about closures or you don't yet understand them fully. That's completely normal. I'm going to leave some links in the description so you can learn more about them. But you know what? Let's go through just one more example together just so we can solidify the knowledge. So let's delete this and let's create a new function. We're going to call that function init just to initialize something. And then in here, we're going to have, let's say a variable called, let's do hobby. And hobby is going to be learning JavaScript, just like that. Now we're going to have an inner function called display hobby. And then inside of there, we are going to console log, you guessed it, hobby, just like that. So let's write some comments here. Let me make this a bit smaller, extract this on the side. And now, as you can see, this thing here is gonna be the local variable created by init function, just like that. Then we have a display hobby function is the inner function or a closure. Then we are using a variable created in the parent function. And then just right there, we're gonna call the inner function, display hobby. Just like that. And for this to work, we also need to call the init function. If we save this, we get learning JavaScript, which works perfectly. We get the variable and it takes the value of the outer function scope. That's fine. Now let's take a step back and go through this example as the JavaScript interpreter would go through it. Init function creates a local variable called hobby and a function called display hobby. The display hobby function is an inner function that is defined inside of an init function and is only available within the body of the init function right here. Note that the display hobby function has no local variables of its own. However, since inner functions have access to the variables of outer scopes, display hobby can access the variable called hobby and then we can console log it. So now if you run the code, you can notice that the console log statement within the display hobby function successfully displays the value of the hobby variable, which is declared in its parent function. Nested functions have access to variables declared in the outer scope. Now, if we do the same thing as we did before, where we're going to return the function rather than declaring it right here, and then we're going to create a new function, so const myfunc is going to be equal to the actual call of the init function like this, and then we're going to call the my function like that. The output should be the same. You can see we get learning JavaScript. So running this code has exactly the same effect as the previous example of the init function. What's different and interesting is that display hobby inner function is returned from the outer function before being executed. At first glance, it may seem unintuitive that this code still works. In some programming languages, the local variables within a function exist only for the duration of the function's execution. Once the init function has finished executing, you might expect that the hobby variable would no longer be accessible. You can see it's only in this scope. However, because the code still works as expected, this is obviously not the case in JavaScript. The reason is that functions in JavaScript form closures. I completely understand that this may still not make a lot of sense to you, and that's completely fine. I just wanted to include this tricky concepts part because that's something that's often asked at interviews, and you don't really use it all that much in everyday JavaScript life. But it's here, you have it. I'm gonna leave some links below as well so you can further improve your knowledge of the tricky concepts in JavaScript. Don't worry, much more interesting and fun things are coming, and they're also easier than this one, so no worries at all.